simplest form, the humanities has been described as the words, ideas, and stories that help make us make sense of our lives and our world. They introduce us to people we've never met, places we've never been, and ideas we may never have thought of. The humanities provide broad knowledge about the best achievements and the worst of human beings throughout history. So how do you take the studies of humanities, or simply said art history, word history, and English literature, and a whole lot more, out of the post-secondary classroom and into the hands of the masses? To wrestle with that question are my guests, Constance Crompton, she's the Associate Professor of Digital Humanities and English, and Hussien Keshani, I've got that right, Associate Professor, Art History, and they're both from the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies here at UBC Okanagan. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. I often get the sense that members of the community beyond the university community are really sort of interested in history, and so I think the key is for us to find ways to share what we know with the public and to help let the public know that they too are sort of legitimate producers of knowledge in this system. I've been working on a project with Ray Siemens at the University of Victoria for a few years now with the public on a publicly editable edition of a 16th century monograph. And originally he had been working just sort of on the project on his own, but he got so many calls from the public, who are really big Tudors fans, or who would tweet at him and say, what are you working on, and we want to know more about Elizabethan England. And so he thought, this would be a good way to kind of an opportunity to open things out and to have something in a wiki space where folks can collaborate with each other, or in another kind of platform where both the public and scholars can work together.
So once he did that, how did that work for you?
As a project, it was a real pleasure. We moved the edition into Wikibooks, which is a sister platform to Wikipedia.
Right.
And there's an existing editorial community who's really interested in producing book-like content. We did find there that the threshold of entry was a bit high sort of technologically for some folks who are sort of new to that technology, so we're looking at other platforms that might help get those interested people who are writing in and saying, we love the Tudors, engaged in some of that Elizabethan English research.
So for you, Hussien, how do you see us being able to do that?
I think forming partnerships between research scholars and institutions, especially like museums, art galleries, in my case, botanic gardens, is really a vital part, because those institutions have bigger audiences and encounter thousands of people. And I think through partnerships, we can make our research more widely available and more accessible, but to an audience that is also attracted to what we're dealing with.
So what are people usually using? I mean, the internet, obvious, but are they using things like Facebook to communicate? What other forms of social media and digital formats are they using?
Do you know, I think there's a real sort of variety there. I think for a lot of us, we feel like, the first thing we should do is like get everything out onto the web, because that's where people are. And for some content, that's appropriate. And then sometimes things like community meetings, public lectures, being engaged, at the museum, which have these wonderful sort of sold-out events, is the right place to be.
So tell us a little bit about the research that you're doing. You were talking about botanical gardens, and so talk about what you're doing and how that relates to this discussion.
Yeah, one of my projects is called the Evolving the Botanic Garden project. It's funded by Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for Canada. And what it involves is developing a mobile interpretation program for the Devonian Botanic Garden at the University of Alberta. Botanic gardens are outdoor museums, but museums of plants. But they're also places where stories about culture, the natural environment, histories of science, and histories of garden designs are told. So the question is, how do people access that content? Mm-hmm. How do they learn more? How do they enrich their experiences of being there? Traditionally, the way has been through signs, through pamphlets. And so what we're exploring is how mobile technology can play a really exciting role in that.
So do you have to develop the application yourselves? What's the process in that?
Yeah, the process is actually really complex. We have to both form the network of people and partners. So there's the administrative component. Then there's the technology planning and design, figuring out what all the technologies are, and then figuring out what the stories and experiences that will complement all of those things and manage everyone's interests and agendas. And then also, the most interesting part is doing the actual research, the history of the cultures, the history of the ideas, the history of the plants, and finding compelling ways to talk about those things.
If you're going to use an electronic version, you do have to make it interesting. I mean, you've got to get the person onto their device and wanting to utilize it. So do you find the storytelling has to be a little different than if you have, a text version or a signage?
Absolutely. We're really wrestling with that problem. Many visitors to the Botanic Garden, for example, the Devonian Botanic Garden, struggle with whether technology should even be there, because people think, well, we go to the garden to get away from everything, and here you are bringing it back. So I think what it means is that we have to really, for example, one thing we're talking about is the importance of audio-based storytelling as being central to the experience, so that your eyes aren't competing with the actual experience of the garden setting. So that's a different way of thinking, to think in terms of soundscapes you're constructing. Then your whole research agenda shifts into the history of music that will complement those things. So that's how thinking through those problems affects the direction of what you're looking into.
So it's a little different than typical research, because you're actually thinking about the end user. You're thinking about the person that's going to have that experience and what's going to be meaningful and what's going to help them understand what they're watching and listening to, and the music plays a big role in that. Constance, you're actually looking at digital media and history in a little different way. Why don't you tell us about some research you're working on?
Certainly. Well, I mean, I must say, I think we're used to sharing or planning our research with the goal of sharing it with a scholarly audience. And I think more and more scholars are also interested in sharing their research with other community groups as well. I'm working on a project which has also been funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada that traces all the events of the gay and lesbian liberation movement in Canada, from protests to poetry readings to pieces of legislation, and that really kind of captures that history. We have it in text form, and it's certainly available as a book. It's something that someone could read from front to back, but we're also taking that textual material and making it available through maps and timelines, so that if you wanted to see all of the pieces of legislation through the 70s and then all the protests that followed, you could look at those on a map, for example. And we too are hoping to experiment with meeting people where they are with this information. So the book works well in a scholarly context. The website will also be available for folks to read, sort of no matter where they are, if they have an internet connection. But we're also thinking about designing large data projections for things like Pride celebrations, where we'll be able to look at, say, a social network graph broadcast really, shown really sort of largely on the side of a building or a screen that shows the history of this community in the context of the community today. And our goals there are really to engage with that history in order to work with people to imagine a future that's sort of different from our present. I have a bit of a hobby horse about it, but I think if we can understand that the past is different from the way that we live now, it also empowers us to imagine a different future and to not just rely on the stereotypes that we have about particular groups, to know that there's a real history there and a future that might be different than one we have today.
How important is it to be able to have electronic versions in the sense of accessibility?
Well, I mean, if you don't mind my leaping right in, I think most scholars, do want their work to have to reach a large audience. And I think one of the things that's been a challenge with the digital is how ephemeral it is and how expensive it is to produce. So I think we're quite lucky that we have funding, and so that we can make our work open access and available to the public. But I think it's a real challenge for folks who don't have that kind of funding, who are trying to work out models to make their stuff available to the public and make sure that it stays up there in the long run, in the way that we've come to enjoy with books that are archived by our libraries.
I think there's an onus too, though, once you digitalize something, to have it maintained. I think that's another issue. Do we have to have more people doing the work that make sure that everything's up to date? Because there's an expectation when you go on the internet or when you get these types of information done this way, is that it's up to date. right? In a book, you could look at it and say, it was published, 10 years ago, so your expectation is it's going to be out of date. So how do you deal with that? How do you keep the information that you're going to put in these gardens constantly updated?
Yeah, I think that's part of the really putting a lot of thought into the programs or the administration of the content and thinking long term. So thinking over the life of, say, the institution or the project, how is this content going to be constantly updated? One of the things we're exploring is partnering a course that I will be developing and teaching with the Botanic Garden. So the part of the class work would be to be updating the content that would be part of the mobile interpretation program. So developing those kinds of long-term relationships are, I think, essential for creating strategy of how to keep content fresh and up to date. I just want to add that I think when you asked about the use of digital media to more broadly disseminate scholarly knowledge, I think it's expected actually today. It's not even a question anymore. People expect to be able to access our ideas through digital media. And so the responsibility falls on us to try to move in that direction as best as we can.
And it's really twofold. It's not even the demand from the outside, but it's the responsibility that we get the word out, that we are able, as UBC, make sure that what we're discovering and what our research is about and what our knowledge is about gets out there. That it's a two-way thing. The demand, supply and demand, I guess it boils down to.
It's an exciting time to be working through these questions, and when we think about like the Gutenberg press and sort of these early printed books, it took them almost 100 years to come up with the standard apparatus that we think of as quite normal now, like having page numbers, which is like revolutionary, and like italics. People weren't sure whether or not italics should be, under copyright, and should everyone be able to use italics, or should that just be reserved for special things? And I think we're kind of at that stage with particularly dissemination through the internet. We've sort of been able to make things digital since the 1940s, and we've had the commercial web since the middle 1990s. So we're really only 25 years in. Who knows what the page numbers or the other sort of things that become the norm of the internet will turn out to be.
And I suppose the challenge is also technology ever changing. What we're used to today may be changed in another 5 years so dramatically. We'll have to be on top of it so that we could be ready for the change.
Yeah, I think it's easy to be enthralled with digital things and technology, but for me, one of the greatest virtues of the humanities is that it causes us to reflect and think critically about the worlds we live in, and to become more literate about different people, different worlds, and to really engage with the hard questions that we're confronted with. And to me, I see the turn towards the digital as in service of those broader ideals.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And that wraps up this edition of Vantage Point Research.